And we're live, joined by Jon Anik. Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time. It means the world.
My pleasure to be with you, buddy. How are you?
Good. So, as I said just a few seconds ago, I like to start off by seeing if my guest has a little something or a story that the world doesn't already know about Jon Anik.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you two things. I mean, a lot of people know that I'm an identical twin, but I don't think people maybe quite realize how much of a role that plays in my life. You know, he happens to live 3 miles from my house right now, which wasn't always the case, but it's very weird when you got somebody walking this earth who sounds like you, looks like you, thinks like you, shares DNA with you. So it's a very special bond, and certainly something that's a special part of my life. The thing I think that UFC fans would find interesting was that I did have to. I had to box a fraternity brother in a tough man competition.
Did you win?
And I won. Yeah, I mean, I got called out by a dude who smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. So, not that my lungs weren't a little black, I guess, back then, but, I had to win that fight. And it was 3 rounds. It was 3 minutes per round. We had lacrosse gloves and lacrosse helmets, and we were both hands on our knees in that third and final round, just sucking wind. But
So it went to a decision?
went to a decision. I couldn't get him out of there. No body shots. Everything was to the head. So it's like, there's only so much you could do, I guess. But maybe not enough power on my side.
Are we talking unanimous or a split? Was it a close
Oh,
call?
yeah. No, the judges were unified. I think it was 2 rounds to 1, though. I did drop a round in there. So
Beautiful. So first question for you is, did you ever imagine, you started with the UFC in 2011, did you
Yes,
ever
sir.
imagine that here you are today as the lead play-by-play commentator for the UFC?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you leave ESPN, I think ultimately your goal would be that eventually you'd be able to ascend to the top fights and doing the title fights. I certainly think it helps me do the job now that I was so immersed in sort of not the bottom half of the roster, but I was doing all those small shows. So, you're capping fights that aren't necessarily title fights. So when you get a chance to do the big fights, I think it gives you real opportunity to sort of open up a little bit when it comes to your play-by-play drawer. So it's been great. It's been fun. But yeah, certainly. I mean, I think anytime you leave ESPN and you sort of think about what could have been had I stayed there, maybe you get your own show one day and everything else. You hope to ascend to the number one job. I didn't think it would happen this quickly necessarily, but as I, used to tell my broadcasting students, you got to be ready whenever that opportunity comes. And I guess thankfully, to whatever degree, I was ready.
Did you always know you wanted to go into broadcasting?
Yeah, I mean, I was a clean sports writer, which I think was my initial hope, but I kept running into better writers. My copy was always clean, Felix, but I just wasn't a great creative writer. And then I felt like when I would have to converse and get into an argument with guys about sports, I could articulate myself pretty well. So I gravitated that way and got a couple lucky breaks along the way, and here we are, I guess.
Were you always, I mean, what amazes me about people like yourself and Rogan and, the best commentators out there is how comfortable you guys are talking. Obviously, it's part of the job. Have you always been comfortable kind of conversing and, quickly analyzing things on the dot, or is it something that you have to work for?
Yeah, no, I mean, I always liked public speaking. I never minded being in front of a crowd. I get more nervous speaking to like a kindergarten class than I do going on television for the UFC. It's the truth. I don't know why I have that emotion going in to like read to my daughter's class versus going on TV in front of a million people. But yeah, I was certainly not a valedictorian, but like I gave my high school graduation speech, and I always enjoyed being up in front of a crowd and never really had any issue with that. But yeah, I guess, my twin brother was always the performer. I was sort of laying back in the cut, just wanting to be a sports writer, be on the radio and not have my face on TV. But one thing kind of led to another, I guess. But yeah, I guess always comfortable. I try to be a better listener, I guess, nowadays.
I was watching an interview of you recently where you say, in talks about your preparations for UFC events, you say cram is a very ugly word for TV preparation. How do you go about in your preparations and, trying to ultimately not cram as much as you can?
Yeah, I forget what I said exactly about cramming, right? There's a negative connotation
Right.
with cram because in some way it insinuates you haven't gotten ahead of the preparation. But I can assure you, when I'm
Oh,
doing 5 UFC live events in 6 weeks, there's only so much prep you can do. But it's an open book test, as Brian Stan always used to say. So you might as well show up with some fucking notes, right? I mean, they don't take them away from you when you get to the arena. And Would I prep more hours if I didn't have 3 kids under the age of 9? I don't see how I wouldn't be able to prep more, right? If you think about it, like, what would I do with all those hours that I parent? I would probably be watching film, but I do a healthy amount right now for sure. But I think that you try to avoid cramming and you try to get as ahead of it as you can, so that when you do have those last few hours, you can maximize those as well, I guess. But, dude, our shows are beasts, man. I mean, 26, 28 fighters. I mean, you're watching these things, right? It's an animal unlike a football game, I can assure you of that.
So what will you kind of take us through what, for one event, what it looks like? Are you watching tape? Are you listening to interviews? How do you kind of gather all the material? And ultimately, I mean, you just have, a couple, 25, 30 seconds when they're walking out, and there's such limited information that you're going to end up using. How do you kind of go about selecting that?
Right. We probably only use about 30% of what we prepare, if that, unfortunately. I mean, especially when there's a quick fight. Those walkouts oftentimes are not televised. Certainly in the U.S., you're not getting every single walkout. But the preparation process, I think, has evolved. We now talk to every fighter either by phone or in person, which obviously is a very important thing to do. But to have that access to every single fighter during fight week is key. The voiceover work starts about 10 days out. Some of the combo features and things that you hear in the arena all gets voiced on this headset that I'm using right now talking to you. And then my fighter card process usually begins Saturday or Sunday. And, I've posted them on Instagram. They probably take me 10 or 12 hours to do the whole card because I handwrite everything. Helps my old ass commit this stuff to memory. But it's a process, man. I mean, you really have to love it. I do watch film. Oftentimes I'll be like writing my fighter card. I'll have the film on. But as I say, man, it's like if the fight card somehow got delayed 5 hours, we could maximize that time. It's like there's never enough time in theory when you have 26 athletes, every other week at least.
Will you talk about that first time that you were called to be cage side? What's going through your head? Are you nervous?
Well, once the fight starts, right, you lean back on your strengths. So I did Bellator season 1 in 2009. And I remember telling my fiance, I think at the time, like, dude, they got the wrong guy. Like, what am I doing going to call these fights right now? But once the fight starts, you talk and you try to play to your strengths. And I did go down that rabbit hole recently and listen to some of my Bellator stuff from 10 years ago. And I was much more an analyst then, right? Like, I'm really supposed to stay in my lane and not be an analyst. I'm supposed to call the shots as they happen. I was given too many opinions probably back then would be my biggest criticism. But yeah, man, I can't be a lifelong martial artist in that seat, right? Because I'm not a lifelong martial artist. So I could try to cram, right? And, do more, not skip as many jiu-jitsu classes as I do right now. But I have to play to my strengths, which is, I believe, a sports broadcast. And, my instincts from now watching this fight pretty aggressively for, 15 years.
How did you get interested with MMA in general?
I was hosting a boxing radio show, and Gary Shaw, who was starting Elite XC, invited our boxing show to go on the road to Tunica, Mississippi, to Elite XC 1, I think it was. And star-studded, man. Gina Carano fought Julie Kedzie. Bigfoot fought Cabbage Correa. Charles Crazy Horse Bennett against KJ Noons. On and on it went. Mike Pyle was on the card. I'm leaving out some studs, too. Main event was Frank Shamrock and Renzo Gracie. So I go as a sort of a close-minded boxing radio host, and I was blown away watching mixed martial arts live in person for the first time. That was 2007. I've pretty much been hooked ever since, and I will certainly watch every UFC pay-per-view, working it or otherwise, till the day I die.
What's it like internally being on the inside of MMA and UFC in particular to see, such an exponential rise in such a short period of time? I mean, you see how the weights. I mean, you're just in Australia for 57,000.
Yeah.
What's it like on the inside to see a sport grow so quickly?
When you don't get asked that question regularly, you don't stop and think about it, because it's on to Boston, and then 10 days later, I got New York City. So I appreciate the question. I think when I get some distance from it, maybe I'll allow myself to sort of think about how amazing the run has been. But watching the evolution of the UFC athlete, even if you just look at like the calf kicks as one example, and how all of a sudden guys are rendering their opponent one-legged fighters very early on in these fights. It's a trend that certainly wasn't there 2011, 2012, 13, and on it goes. So that, I think, has been the coolest part, to see the athletes get better, to see the sport evolve, to see the roster of 600 all be worthy of their roster spots right now is pretty incredible to look at the depth and television deals and everything else, man. It's been pretty crazy, but these shows are a bear, man. So I'm sort of in it, tunneled right now.
Have you been able to, even yourself in your own career, just take a step and realize, like, just 7-8 years ago I wasn't doing? I mean, now you're on every single pay-per-view, the biggest events. Does it ever feel weird to you? Have you had a second to kind of process it yourself?
Sometimes I think you think about it when you do get the opportunity to be a fan again, like this past weekend, and I watched the Tampa show, and it's like, wow. I mean, I wish it wasn't 7 hours, but this is pretty fun to be able to watch these fights. So sometimes I miss being able to sit around with my brothers and watch a championship fight. But yes, what a blessing, man. There's nothing like the adrenaline of a pay-per-view as a broadcaster. I'd imagine an NFL playoff game might have a similar feel, but I don't know. The intensity of a UFC championship fight for me as a fan is crazy. Like, it feels like a Super Bowl every time there's a UFC belt on the line. And I don't think those emotions would change if I was sitting home for these fights now. But I'm certainly glad I'm there.
Are you self-critical when you hear yourself, when you're rewatching fights and you hear your broadcasting? Are you someone who hears it and you're like, I shouldn't have said that, or I would have done this differently? Or do you accept the way it is and happy with the way you prepare?
Yeah, I mean, you just got to move on, right? Like Bill Belichick says, it's on to fucking Cincinnati. I mean, you're going to be judged by every utterance over 7 hours, and that's just the way it is. So you just kind of got to deal with it, and that sort of becomes your new reality. I mean, Dana White sort of warned me of as much back in 2011, and that's just kind of the way it is. You try to have those instances be fewer and further between when you're listening and you're cringing and you're like, oh, God, But yeah, you get sick of the sound of your own voice, right? I have an identical twin brother, so I already hear my own voice, and then you talk for a living. So I'd imagine my children are very sick of my voice at this point.
Will you talk about your relationship with Dana and how he, I mean, we see how he manages the UFC from the outside, but internally, what he's like as the big boss of the UFC?
Well, he's still in charge of the entire live production. He still fine-tooth combs the entire production and is very hands-on. And, humbly, I think our whole team has really gotten into a good groove when it comes to these live events and doing not just 41 out of 52 weeks a year, but also doing the Contender Series and everything that goes along with that, which I don't do. But yeah, I mean, he is a guy who is certainly monitoring our every utterance, and you try to be clean and you try to not hear from him, right? No news is good news most of the time. But they entrust me with a lot, which for sure, I do more post-fight interviews than anybody just in terms of my schedule. I take every responsibility they give me. emceeing a weigh-in in front of a pay-per-view crowd when Joe Rogan can't be there. I take it all very seriously. And, thankfully he's kept me around this long. I don't take it for granted. I understand that there's always going to be sensitivities from the execs, and I'm only as good as my last show. So hopefully in my hometown of Boston, it's a clean one, Felix,
No, I mean, that's one of the, for someone that's young like myself and interested in potentially broadcasting or the executive side of sports, it's what I said to you when we were messaging a while back is you really are truly the one person that I look up to as someone who's, the gold standard of professionalism and preparation. And I think that, one of the things that I also saw in one of your interviews was you talking about how you feel like, this was back in 2012, that every single time you're cage side, you feel like you need to prove yourself, that you don't take it for granted. And, in that you don't even I see that from the fact that you're still here for so long. But even my next question is, keeping that same energy from that first fight to that last fight, the same way that you've kept that energy from your first time cage side to now your time cage side. How do you keep that same drive and that passion? Is it because you love it so much? Is it because it's a job? Is it because it's a mixture of all those things?
Well, it's tricky. I think for anyone who performs for a living, at least for me, there is going to be some performance anxiety. It's not when I'm at the arena, but sometimes during fight week or on fight day, you get in your own head a little bit and you're sort of thinking, not unlike maybe a fighter thinks. I mean, I hate to even compare what we do to fighting, but it's like, why do I do this for a living, right? Because there is some pressure on you in these situations. And sometimes you feel like, hey, maybe there'd be an easier way to make a living, and you try to eliminate those thoughts because this is my dream job and this is what I want to do. But, it's tricky. I mean, you try to stay out of your own head as best you can and just be confident in your skills and just be confident that all the repetitions that you've had before you get to the big show have been put in well. I mean, I appreciate what you say about the preparation, and my producers have certainly said to me, like, don't ever lose that, not like you don't have anything else going for you, but keep preparing because that's something that you can always control. And that's the thing is like it's evolved. It's gotten better. I can't say I put in more time because there's always been just so many hours, but the way we do it has definitely evolved.
How does one improve as a commentator?
Well, the toughest thing to your question earlier is you have to watch and listen to yourself. Even like my podcast that I do on Mondays, I got to go back and listen to those if I want to get better, right? If I want to get cleaner and eliminate verbal crutches, like I always say, So I think the only way is to watch yourself and listen to the people close to you, whether it's your bosses or your brothers, and just, yeah, I mean, you can't be getting worse. That's the thing, right? And you mentioned the energy, and thankfully with these live events, the energy around you is something you feed off of. Certainly when you have energetic broadcast partners like DC and Rogan and everybody else that sits in those seats, it helps. But it's definitely an energetic atmosphere and one that is unlike anything that I've experienced in pro sports.
Will you talk about your chemistry, of sitting and commentating next to DC, Dominic Cruz, Rogan? How do you feel like over the years you've improved, and how does, what's it really like when you're in that booth? Because, I watch UFC every weekend, and we see the fight one way, and you guys are cage side, you see it a different way. But talk about how that dynamic of not only like just literally visually how it's different from watching a fight on TV, but also how you guys work together and how that's maybe improved and worked on that chemistry over the years.
Well, it's incredible. It's amazing to think how many different broadcast combinations we've had for me in 8 years, probably 15 different combinations, and they all bring so many different skills and personality traits to the table. Largely in a three-man booth, I damn well better have something good to say if I'm going to get in there, right? Because to my right is one of the greatest of all time in DC, and Joe Rogan, who is a future Hall of Famer in his own right. So MMA play-by-play inherently is different than football, right? Whereas I'm calling the play, the analyst talks about it, and then 3rd down and 6, it's like, that's me, right? It's very clear, like, you're supposed to talk right now, and Troy Aikman is not. So I think we've sort of gotten better at sort of staying in our lane as far as the broadcast is concerned. But it is just, it's incredible, man, working with all of these guys. I mean, I truly am so blessed. And I know when it comes to like the sports Emmys, like mixed martial arts isn't necessarily going to get recognized. I mean, what an absolute travesty that Joe Rogan has never received a sports Emmy for all the years he's been doing the UFC. But I just, for whatever reason, I don't know. I think I'm an old man, but I think it's an old man's game. Like, I think the veterans are going to be rewarded with the gold, and that's absolutely fine. But I just think largely our MMA analysts, the fighters, don't get nearly the national credit they deserve for being as good as anybody on NFL Live or any other show that you could trot out there.
I think it's definitely coming soon, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think what is it like when you guys are not on booth and you're just do you hang out with DC and Rogan, and do you guys joke around? Is it like is it family now because you guys spend so much time together?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I was calling fights with Brian Stam, we would eat every meal together. I mean, it was like truly a spouse on the road. But yeah, I mean, all the time. I mean, I think that only is going to help your chemistry. Dominic and I have gotten very close, certainly with DC, and, don't get to eat dinner with Rogan as much as I used to because now I'm doing those post shows, but it certainly is going to help us in the booth when we're breaking bread together. And it's always a pleasure, being able to dine and spend time with just absolute legends. It's weird when you find yourself, at least for me, it was a few years ago, 2013, sitting in a hotel room talking about fighting with Dominic Cruz. It's like, feel like I should be like recording this right now. And now he's one of my best friends. So as is DC. So it's been great, man. Paul Felder's a great dude. And, it's a lot of fun. It's never a dull moment. I'm hoping to get a chance to work with Bisping a little bit more because he is just a crazy bastard. We share a sense of humor, and he's a great broadcaster, obviously, as you guys have seen over the last year or so.
How do you not do you get nervous when you see those guys that you know pretty well get in the cage? And how do you not keep a bias towards them? Because of course you know probably DC better than you know most. I mean, you probably get to know a lot of the fighters, but of course you want to I don't want to say you want to see DC win, but that's still your boy. So how do you not keep that bias?
Oh, I want to see DC beat Stipe. I mean, make no mistake about it. But it's very easy to keep that out of it. I watched back the first 16 minutes of his second fight with Stipe, and I stand by the call. I thought DC won all 3 rounds. There's no narrative. There's no preconceived thought as to how we're going to call a fight. Sometimes maybe we go too far down a line to the average fan. We control the public perception sometimes, and that just comes with the territory. I wish that wasn't always the case, because to your point, we can disagree, and you guys can disagree with how a fight plays out. But I absolutely hate calling fights involving my friends. Hate calling Felder Barboza 2. Hate calling Cormier against Stipe. Might call out of a fight if I ever have to call Dominic Cruz's fight. No, there's nothing fun about it. It's very anxious. But that said, it's just like Bellator 1. Once the red light is on, once the fight starts, I'm not thinking about him as my friend whatsoever. You're really not.
Do you feel the magnitude of some of the bigger fights that you've called? I mean, the big one that stands out to me is, of course, Conor Khabib last year. Do you feel like there's a special, different kind of energy for a fight of that magnitude?
Yes, but God, like you're asking me after Adesanya Whitaker a couple weeks ago, which felt enormous, right? So, as I said earlier, the championship setting in the UFC is unlike anything in professional sports. So for me, I get butterflies. I mean, for Covington Lawler with no belt on the line, I get butterflies, not for the broadcasting part of it. The fan in me gets butterflies, as I'm sure you do, as if your team is in a playoff game or the Super Bowl. It's a very similar feeling. So I would put most of those title fights, Khabib and Abu Dhabi, very close to Conor Khabib. But you certainly want to be sharp those nights and, more anxious packing your suitcase, I think, those weeks than others.
Do you think we're going to see a Conor Khabib too?
Well, Khabib is a champion like Israel Adesanya and like Max Holloway. They want to fight the number one contender, right? And Conor's going to have to become the number one lightweight contender, it would seem to me, for Khabib to take that fight.
He's good at skipping the line, though.
He's very good, and certainly I would think one win would put him in line. I think Khabib would acknowledge him with one victory as the number one contender, as long as Tony gets his opportunity. But you're starting to see these champions. Adesanya giving part of his moment to Paulo Costa, Max Holloway giving Alexander Volkanovski the title fight in a reasonable time frame. You're seeing a lot of these champions who want to fight the best guy, the number one contender, and Khabib is certainly that guy. So you're basically asking me if I think Conor is going to beat Justin Gaethje or whomever he shares the octagon with, and I will say no comment on that. But I think if he wins a fight, the rematch could materialize. But Tony obviously is a live dog against Khabib, so a lot would have to align for that fight to happen, in my humble opinion.
In your humble opinion, who do you think is the greatest mixed martial artist of all time?
Oh, geez, Felix. There's so many different ways you really could go with this. I mean, John Jones is certainly the first name that comes to mind. Thiago Santos' fight was very close, and I think because our sport is so young, we're allowed to have the greatest of all time conversation because we're only 30 or so years into this. But one loss can all of a sudden swing the pendulum, right? If you think DJ beat Henry Cejudo, as many people do, is he not the greatest of all time? But certainly for me, skill for skill, the best fighter that I've ever seen is John Jones.
Where do you see the UFC on a global scale in 5 to 10 years? I mean, at this point, it's even harder to think that it could get bigger, but do you see it getting even bigger?
Yeah, I mean, I think the magnitude of the show can get bigger, right? We're doing 41 shows a year, and I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that you would have 20% of the schedule be like that Melbourne show where you have 50,000 plus. So I think that would be the trend, but it's amazing how big we are globally, right? I mean, we go to Australia, and it's like, dude, they are rabid. I mean, everybody who works at the airport has watched the UFC the night before, and that is not the case in the United States of America. So I still, as I do interviews like this, will contend that I hope that we can continue to build the domestic footprint and use this ESPN platform to our utmost advantage,
And then on a personal note, where do you think? I mean, you're 41 now. You're still. You say you're old.
Oh,
You're still quite young.
oh,
Come on. Where do you see? Like, how do you go forward as well? Do you have any career goals? Is there more you want to do? I mean, you're the lead play-by-play commentator for the UFC. Most people say, okay, well, I've reached my final destination. How do you kind of keep pushing yourself to do more, and what does that look like for you?
well, I think kids are the ultimate motivator. I am a huge NFL fan, and I think I would be lying if I said I wouldn't like to, having done a couple college football games, get a chance to do an NFL game, before I put the headset down for good. But, my kids are a huge motivator for me. And I don't know, like the UFC has ruined a lot of other sports for me, right? Like I can't even sit through a Major League Baseball at bat anymore. So if you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have been, oh, maybe do that Red Sox grind at some point. And it's like, there's no way. I can't even, I got to lock my phone up to watch a single at bat. But I love football. I do love having part of my NFL Sundays at home with the family, obviously. But I think the NFL pull will always be there. I wouldn't mind going back to Boston and being on the radio 5 days a week and being able to be home with my kids an extra 100 nights a year. So there's that tug as well. I really don't know. I guess part of me would love to just crawl in a hole and be a stay-at-home dad and coach my kids, but I'm not sure that's in the cards.
You do talk a lot, and I think it's remarkable how how you're able to balance being on the road and your kids are clearly the focal point of your life. How do I mean, you talk about it a little bit, but what is it like managing a family with 3 kids, a wife, and being on the road in these vast variety of countries and towns and cities all the time?
Well, I'm glad you got a young start on the microphone, my man. I don't know. You don't strike me as someone who's got a bunch of kids hanging around, but it's a balancing act for sure, right? And you just try to be as invested as humanly possible when you're home, because everything cuts into it. Podcast every Monday. Interviews like this, everything cuts into it. But I got a little baby, right? I made the mistake, or I made the decision. I mean, my wife better not see this. We made the decision to run it back after our 2 daughters were off and running, 8 and 6 years old. So no, we got a baby boy, and
I hear he's the first boy of the family.
How about that? You've done your research. Yeah, we got like 6 girls, and he is certainly the king. So, but no, it's a lot for sure. But that's why, like, I'm a Boy Scout on the road, and I'm just in my room filling out fighter cards because, when I'm home, I really try to be in it with the kids as much as possible.
All right, just to wrap things up, how do you want to be remembered when it's all said and done? The legacy of Jon Anik as a commentator, or perhaps even more?
Gosh, it's so hard, and when you're a father, right, to even think about anything, because a lot of the burden that we have on ourselves as individuals to succeed or to provide, whatever it is, once you have kids, it's like they become the center of your life, whereas you've always been the center of your life. So they're the center of my life, right? So that's really my legacy. Certainly, I hope my UFC legacy is of somebody who contributed a lot to the sport and helped us, just get cleaner and better across the board when it comes to the broadcast, whether it comes to pronunciations or professionalism or whatever you want to say. It's something I take very seriously, and I feel like our whole approach is just very different than it was in 2011 compared to what it is here 8-9 years later. So hopefully that would be part of my legacy. But yeah, man, it's just on to the next show, and I guess there will be time to reflect. Hopefully one day if we can, keep running on the treadmill or something, dude. But 41, man. I mean, what year were you born, Felix? Can I ask what year you were born?
What age what year do you think I was born?
I mean, you seem very well spoken, but that doesn't mean you can't be 18, 19 years old.
What's your final prediction?
I don't want to disrespect you and say
I will not be
you're
disrespected.
18 years of age. I mean, are you 20?
I'm 19. I'm 19 years of age.
Good for you. I mean, good for you.
Thank you very much.
No children?
Well, no, not yet. I think my mom would be a little bit worried about that.
Well, that's great. Good for you, man. That really good for you. So what year were you born then? If you're
2000. I'm a 2000.
Absolutely incredible.
Anyways, Jon, I wanted to before I let you go, crazy because what you don't know, I don't use Twitter. I just created a Twitter, and I've never tweeted at someone to get them on the podcast. And the way that this even came about is because I randomly tweeted at you by literally a long shot that I thought in my head. I said, fuck it, like maybe he'll respond. And I remember then I actually was exhausted. I took a nap and I woke up to your message, and I thought I was still napping. I was shocked and surprised, and I sent it to my friend Jonah, who's a huge fan of yours and a huge fan of the UFC. And I said, you won't believe who I'm getting on the podcast. I mean, I've had Eric Anders on, I've had Heather Hardy, like I've had some great people, but you are such a different, it's like a niche kind of domain. But I just want to say, as someone who, as you now know, I'm 19, very into broadcasting and to potentially the executive side of sports and sports in general. A huge fan of you and the UFC. It's a tremendous honor, and as I said, you're for me the gold standard of professionalism and broadcasting and preparation, and gives me a good model of what I hope to become if just a fraction of you. So thank you so much for taking the time. It was truly an honor.
Dude, likewise, man. I appreciate those words a lot. I really do. I mean, that I think is a huge part of the imprint that you'd hope to make. And while it does make me feel old, it really does mean a lot to me. It really does. And it would to my family if they could hear it. So thank you for that, man. Keep up the grind. I mean, whatever you want to do, man. I mean, the world's your oyster. At 19 years of age, though, to have this all up and running. I mean, I just launched a goddamn YouTube channel like 3 weeks ago, right, for a show that's 5 years old. Okay. So just keep doing your thing, and be happy to chat with you again, down the line.
You're always welcome on, and I'm at UFC Boston next week. I'm on the floor, 10th row. If there's any chance I can shake your hand and say what's up to you, I would absolutely love that.
We will make that happen. Absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jon.
All right, buddy. Have a good day. All right. Pleasure. See ya.